Thank you very much. And again, I'd like to thank the Mohawk Nation for allowing me onto their territory. And like any true Ojibwe, I'll leave when I'm ready. Wow, what an introduction. Where to begin, where to start. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight is basically sort of my own personal journey of exploration of Native humor and how it has sort of, I've been very lucky to have been on, what I like to say, it's like being on the left bank of the left bank of Paris in the 20s and 30s where all these wonderful things were happening, and I was there watching in terms of the development of Native literature and Native humor, both in our community and then expressing it and sharing it with a larger dominant culture. Now, let's start at the beginning. As you heard, I work in many different mediums. To me, I consider myself a contemporary storyteller. And how I tell that story depends on how I feel that story needs to be told. Now, I grew up on the Curve Lake First Nations. That's where I was born. I'm in the unique position of having come from both a large family and a small family. My mother was the oldest of 14. Now that only goes to show what happens when you don't have cable. Yet, however, I am an only child, and my mother blames that on the fact I was 11 pounds, 13 ounces. Breech. No cesarean. So, I grew up in this environment with my mother and this big, huge, extended family. And as you may or may not have figured out, I'm half white. My standard line is, I'm half Ojibwe, half Caucasian, so technically that makes me an occasion. Or as I'd like to say, either a special occasion, at the very least, a memorable occasion. But I really never knew who my father was or that part of the family, so I was grown up in a completely Ojibwe environment. And with my mother's family. Now, I grew up right across from my grandparents, and out in front of my grandparents were these three big, huge ash trees. And in front of the ash trees was a big fire pit and a bunch of chairs around it. And from about late May to early October, almost every night, there was a bonfire and a loose conglomeration of aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends sitting around the fire telling funny stories. That's what I grew up with, listening to these people tell these funny stories. And I grew up right across the road, and back when I was young, right, we didn't have air conditioning. We just had open windows and hopefully like mosquito screens. So every night I went to bed to the sound of people telling funny stories. That was my lullaby. And that stayed with me. I grew up, and my mother, God bless her, sort of indulged that passion with me. She would buy me lots and lots of books. And my mother had a 6th grade education, and she grew up, lived on a reserve. Her first language was Anishinaabe, but she really encouraged that in me and bought me all these books. So I was an avid reader as a child. So I would read these stories of the world outside my reserve as I got older. In fact, I remember when I was 5 years old watching my very first television show and my very first introduction to white people. I distinctly remember my mother taking me over to my grandparents. My grandparents had bought this big square box called a television and put me down in front of it, and they turned it on. And I distinctly remember, as I said, my very first image and impression of white people. It was the Three Stooges. I remember watching this, being afraid, very afraid. And as I got older, and when I think we went to grades 1 and 2 on the reserve, and 3 to 12 we were bused in the nearby town to go to grades 3 and up, and I just remember being intensely afraid I was going to be hit in the face with a shovel. But anyway, so I read and all these different things, and I really learned to love storytelling in whatever form. As I said, I would read and read and read, and we only got like 2 television stations, and they were fuzzy and all that. But as I got older, a couple interesting things happened that sort of obviously affected my journey into writing and humor. First of all, I decided in my mid-teens that I had to leave the reserve and go off and seek my fortune. I did what is called the res math. My reserve is fairly small. It's about at that time it was about 800 people. And you heard how big and huge my family is. I had like 25 first cousins. So I did the math, and it became increasingly apparent to me that I was related to practically every girl on the reserve. And that's as good a reason as any to move to a city of 5 million, half of them women, and I was related to. And I've always thought, why don't most colleges and universities who are trying to recruit Native students use this fact? Anyways, so I'm trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I thought, I like writing. Or I didn't like writing. I hadn't written, but I thought, I want to be a writer. I want to create. Because one of the great things about being a writer is you get to create people, you get to create environments, worlds, universes. You get to create problems, find solutions. It's like the ability to play God without being sacrilegious. And that appealed to me. So two very important things happened to me when I was 16. First of all, I went to my grade 11 English teacher. And I said, is it possible to make a living from creative writing? And I distinctly remember my English teacher not even looking up from his desk saying, no, not really. So I do a lot of lecturing at high schools and universities now, and I always tell them, if there's anything you take away from anything I have to say today, it's always remember, never trust your grade 11 English teacher. Second thing was I went to my mother and told my mother I wanted to be a writer. My mother looked at me very oddly and said, in these exact words, why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere. Now, as I said, my mother had this philosophy that unless you were working class, you had no class, and had spent 50 years working hard, and once told me that she'd never had a job she enjoyed, and really didn't know what a writer was or what writing is, and it was just a completely different philosophy to her. And that was her response to me. Why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere. So, keeping that phrase, in the time since she told me that, I have sent my mother a postcard from India, China, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Mexico, Cuba, the Bahamas, England, Finland, Sweden, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Czech Republic, Austria, France, and Italy, all saying, look where writing got me. And of course, that may sound a little malicious, it's not. I would bring my mother home presents from all over the world. So my mother had one of the most eclectic houses in the reserve with like a fine Indian rug and all this pottery from Mexico and all these different things. So anyways, I ended up in Toronto, kicking around for a while, but because I had been burned and scarred by these two comments, I decided not to be a writer. Cutting through a couple of years there into my mid-20s, some interesting things happened. Most of us believe the contemporary native theatrical renaissance began in 1986, November 22nd, 8 p.m. The wind was out of the east. The Maple Leafs were doing badly. That's when a little play called The Res Sisters opened in downtown Toronto, written by an unknown Cree playwright named Thompson Highway, and basically blew the doors off the larger Canadian theatrical community and made most of the theater patrons, theater critics, theater artists, and theater academics sit up and become aware that Native people had stories to tell and could tell them. It was a pivotal, groundbreaking event that literally changed a lot of our worlds as Native writers. So this happened, right? And I happened to be in Toronto at that time looking for work. I went from contract to contract. I didn't have a career. I didn't have a job. I went from contract to contract, always something to do with the arts, but not as a writer. Just trying. I had a very hungry landlord that I had to keep fed. So I would do all these things. And through a bizarre series of, I even worked on a television show. I don't know, all the people here in their mid-80s, I'll go way back to the mid-80s. Let's go take the time machine. How many people here remember a television series, 13-part children's television series that was, as I said, just around in the mid-80s called Spirit Bay? A handful of people. It was about life on a fictional Indian reserve, northwestern Ontario, seen through the eyes of the kids. And I worked on it as a production assistant, a casting assistant, a chaperone, just whatever, just trying to pay the bills. And after that, in order to make money, I decided to write an article on adapting native stories into a television and film format for a big $75. Things you do to feed your landlord. And I ended up phoning all the story editors on all the television series in Canada at that time, and there wasn't one native scriptwriter in all of Canada at that time. And I don't remember if it was me or her, but one of us suggested, with this one script editor I was talking to, that I submit a story idea just for the heck of it. Now, I'm just about to date myself here. My very first writing credit was for an episode of a show called The Beachcombers. 1,000 years ago. I was 12. So anyways, I ended up writing this show just because nobody else was. If you remember, a third of the cast was native, so I ended up doing that. Now here's where things get interesting in terms of my personal journey as a writer and my work in native humor. At that time, Thompson Highway was the artistic director of Native Earth Performing Arts, Canada's premier native theatre company, and he'd just gotten a grant from the Ontario Arts Council for what was called a writer-in-residency program at Native Earth, meaning they bring somebody in who either is a writer or wants to become a playwright, and they spend time with the theatre company to learn how it works and write something for them. And as is the case with grants like this, unless you spend the money, you have to give it back. And no self-respecting artist likes that. It goes against our grain. And sometimes if you have to give it back, they'll deduct it from next year's budget. So, Thompson had this grant, and at that time there were 2 working native playwrights in Ontario. Thompson, who was the artistic director, and a man named Daniel David Moses, who was the outgoing playwright in residence. So Thompson was desperate. He couldn't find anybody to give the money to, so he did what a lot of desperate people do. He went to the bottom of the barrel, and there I was, passed out. And he came to me and he asked me if I wanted to be the writer in residence. This is how desperate he was. My entire oeuvre of creative writing was a 24-minute episode of The Beachcombers. Not exactly great fodder for a career as a playwright. And Thompson, being Thompson, I'm sure he had no other alternative. So he came to me and he said, "Drew, do you want to be our playwright in residence?" And I said no, because I didn't know anything about theater. The number of plays I'd seen, you could count on my fingers. And the education I'd had on the reserve had taught me that theater was dead white men. And I didn't know any. So I said no. And Thompson cheated. He played hard to get. He said, "Drew, look at it this way. All you have to do is sit through rehearsal in 2 plays, maybe write a play at the end of it. It's 20 weeks work, and it's $400 a week in 1988. And I said, "When do I start?" So I'm one of the few people you'll meet that got into theater for the money. So with that being said, that was my glorious introduction to the world of theater. Now that I was in theater and I was hanging out there, I thought I better do my research. I better figure out what's going on here. And I started reading all the plays I could and trying to figure out what was going on and knew what I was talking about. And this is where it became very apparent to me that native theater, just like at that time, I'm talking from about the mid-late 80s to the early mid-90s, the vast majority of plays, novels, short stories, almost all the things that were being written by Native people or about Native people were dark, depressing, bleak, sad, and angry. And I found that very odd because that was not the reality I knew. I've been very fortunate to have traveled to over 130 Native communities across Canada and the United States, and everywhere I've gone, I've usually been greeted with a laugh, a smile, and a joke. But this wasn't coming across in all the literature, all the plays that we were doing, a lot of the novels that were coming out, the biographies, the short stories. They were all depressing. And as I said, I didn't understand that, because art should reflect all the many different facets of the Native community. And in this case, it wasn't. And almost all of the writings were dark, depressing, and bleak, because as I said, when oppressed people get their voice back, they're going to write about being oppressed. And Thompson Highway has this saying in the introduction to the Red Sisters: before the healing can take place, the poison must be exposed. And that's what was happening during that first generation, if you can call it of Native literature. Native people who had been colonized for 500 years, the residential school system, the reserve system, all these different things, were basically standing up and saying, we've got a few issues to discuss here. And that's what was coming out in those early works. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me. And I sort of understand that anger happening, because when I was talking with the Dalits in India and the Australians, what had happened to the Aborigines in Australia and the Maoris, when you say the Dalits, when you've been at the bottom end of the rung for however many thousands of years, and you're given a chance to tell a story, chances are it's not going to be a comedy. So this was a sort of a healing progression. And I thought, as a Native playwright, in order to write a play, am I going to have to be depressing? And that idea didn't appeal to me. And then as I sort of went out into the community and I was exploring more and more about Native theater and the effect it had on people, several really pivotal things really happened to me that sort of made me think maybe it was time to mine the other end of the spectrum. I remember having lunch with a friend of mine, an actress who's working on a play, and we were having lunch, and she was very depressed, very quiet. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she goes, "Oh, it's this play I'm working on. It's so depressing." And I said, "Why?" She goes, "Well, it can be very tiring being raped 8 times a week, twice on Wednesdays." And then I was coming out of 2 different plays in 2 different cities, and I talked to 2 different women about the play, and I asked the same question: what did you think of the play? And they gave me the exact same answer. They said, "Well, I'm tired of going to see Native plays. I'm tired of being depressed." And that stayed with me. And I began to think about this whole thing about, are we as a people literarily depressed? Because as I said, this wasn't the people I knew in my travels. And then I was on the blood reserve in southern Alberta. I was talking with a blood elder there, and we were talking about this thing, and he said, "Well, you know what I think about this whole topic?" And I said, "What?" He goes, "Well, to me, humor is the WD-40 of healing." And I thought about that. Humor is the WD-40 of healing. That is so cool. That's almost t-shirt worthy. And it goes along with what Thompson said: before the healing can take place, the poison must be exposed. And humor is the WD-40 of healing. And it came together. So I decided I wanted to write humor. I wanted to celebrate the Aboriginal sense of humor, because as I said, it was all one-sided. It was all dark, depressing, bleak, sad, and that wasn't me. That wasn't my family. That wasn't the people I knew. There has to be a counterweight to it. So I decided to start going out and celebrate the Native sense of humor. So I wrote a play. It was called The Bootlegger Blues. And it's a story of a 58-year-old good Christian Ojibwe woman who, through a series of circumstances, finds herself in possession of 143 cases of beer that she has to bootleg to buy an organ for the church. And it's loosely based on a true story. So we produced this play in the Bajamajig Theatre Group up on Manitoulin Island in Georgian Bay. We were all up there working on it, and this is the big irony of the whole situation in me being here. We were up there rehearsing it, working hard at it, and we'd come home at night, grab dinner, watch a little bit of news before going back to work. And this was during the summer of 1990. Anybody here remember what else was happening the summer of 1990? So we're up there, for those who don't get the joke, Oka. So we're up there working hard, we're coming home going, oh, there's something weird happening in Quebec. Oh, those Mohawks. Go back to work. Like we were like out in the middle of nowhere, we were working on this play, and it wasn't until we actually got on the road that we sort of realized what a history-changing event was happening while we were looking at our own navel. And so when I was writing this play, it was a native comedy, and at that time, the term native comedy was considered an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, because there was no such thing. And so at that time, the summer of 1990, I was sitting there I was thinking to myself, man, this is either the best or the worst time for a native comedy. So we went out on tour, we went to native communities in central and southern Ontario and urban environments and played to largely, native or native-friendly urban environments. And surprisingly, the play did well. In fact, I got what I consider my own personal best review of my life. We were actually in Ottawa, University of Ottawa. The show had ended. I was outside talking, I think, with somebody. And this old Indian man sort of walked out. He walked over to us and he looked at me and he said, because I'd been introduced, and he said, "You're the writer of this play?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he reached out and he shook my hand and he said, "Your play made me homesick." And I got all warm and fuzzy and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And so the play did very, very well and very, very successful, as much as a touring native comedy can be successful. But it's what happened sort of next that really sort of talks about the relationship of native humor and the larger dominant culture. I got a call one day saying, "We've just read your play, The Bootlegger Blues, and we'd like to produce it." And I went, "Great, cool, wonderful." And it was being produced by a white theater, white theater company in a place called Port Dover on Lake Erie, if anybody knows that in southern Ontario. It was called Lighthouse Theater. And how can I put this delicately? Their clientele are largely of a blue rinse crowd. Older, non-native, white hair. They're used to British comedies and musicals. But for some reason, the theater company wanted to produce my comedy. Wonderful, let's go down and have some fun. So we went down to Port Dover, rehearsed the play, had a great time doing it. It's a wonderful place. I really love it there. Produced the play, did everything all wonderful and great. Oh, and here's one of the things about culture clash, right? The person designing the poster. As I said, it's about a woman bootlegging beer to raise money to buy an organ for the church. And it all takes place during a powwow. It's a powwow play, as I call it. And the guy who designed the poster, the white guy who works for the company, so I had a picture of a drum with the drumsticks coming down on it, and sitting on the center of the drum was a beer. And so, ew, no. A little cultural explanation there necessary. So anyways, the play's being done, opening night. We're all out there, opening night, sitting there. The show's going on, I'm sitting there all very excited. Lights go up, my little native comedy starts, and I'm surrounded in this theater by about 300, the theater seats 311 people, obviously, because it's a cottage place, almost all white. Curtain goes up, play starts, I'm sitting there, nothing, no laughter whatsoever, quiet. Off in the distance, you can hear the coyote howling. Tumbleweeds went across the stage. And I'm sitting there panicking, going, there goes my career. Maybe there is some disconnect between native humor and the dominant culture's humor. Because the actors were doing really good. They worked hard. The director had done a great job. And let's face it, the writing was brilliant. But nothing. all quiet. And I'm just finding this so peculiar and just getting more and more nervous. So I turn around, I'm watching the audience trying to figure this out. Now, as I said, 311 people, mostly white, but there were about, I'd say, 6 to 8 people there, Native people, who were laughing. Now, I should explain. The play, two of the actors in the play, Port Dover is about 20 minutes from the largest reserve in Canada population-wise, this little place called Six Nations, with I think over 20,000 Iroquois. And 2 of the cast members were from Six Nations. So every production, there were 6 to 10 brothers, sisters, parents, cousins, aunts, uncles there to support the actors. And they're all clumped together in the back and the right-hand side. They were laughing from the beginning. And again, I'm thinking, okay, Native people, they get the joke. White people don't get the joke. But then I'm watching them, and the most interesting thing is happening. I'm watching those group of Native people, and the white people around them start to laugh. A few minutes later, the white people around them start to laugh. And it's like literally like throwing a stone in a pond. The circle got bigger from where the Native people were sitting. And more white people began to laugh. And I suddenly realizing it. At that time, the early 90s, right, was at the height of this socio-political movement called political correctness, where this was an audience that had been taught that you don't laugh at Native people. You know what they've been through? The tragic Indian, the poor Indian, the alcoholic Indian, all the travesties and all the horrible plays and books they've read about Native people. And not only that, this was a play with Native people and beer. So they're sitting there not knowing what to do. And what they were waiting for permission to laugh. So by seeing the Native people laughing, the people right next to them thought, oh, we can laugh. And as I said, it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And by the middle of the first act, everybody was laughing. And the show became actually a big hit, and we beat the box office projection. And I've since been back about 4 other times with other plays. And I mean, the times have changed. After then, Tom King came out with Dead Dog Cafe, and Sherman Alexie was writing his funny novels and all this. So it became much more expected and understood that, yes, Native people have a sense of humor, and you're welcome to join in. Now, the second comedy I wrote was called The Baby Blues. Now, The Baby Blues is a story of an aging powwow dancer, a fancy dancer, who's getting too old to win money on the fancy dance powwow circuit, but he refuses to acknowledge the passing years. He's basically a big kid. He has absolutely nothing to hold him down, no responsibilities, just believes in partying, dancing, and chasing women, not necessarily in that order. He's just, as I said, a big kid. I don't know if you have people like that in your culture. So this is a story where he goes to this powwow on this reserve. It's another powwow play. He goes to this other powwow he hasn't been to in a long time. He's setting up his tent. He sees a beautiful young girl down by the river. He goes down and starts to sweet talk her. And through the conversation, both we and he discover it's his long-lost daughter from his last trip there 18 years ago. Now, don't you hate it when that happens? So he tries to escape. He tries to get away, and he runs into the mother, who sabotages his truck and won't let him leave the reserve until, in that weekend, he can come up with 17 years back child support. Again, don't you hate it when that happens? So, that's the basic story. It's produced in a bunch of places and published, yada, yada, yada. Again, I get a phone call. Somebody said, I just read your play, I like it, and I'd like to produce it. And I said, great, wonderful, send me the check. But he says, no, you're going to have to help me. I said, with what? And he goes, translating it. I said, translating? Where are you calling from? And he goes, oh, I'm sorry. I'm phoning from the University of Venice, Italy. I said, Venice, that's a place with water for streets, right? And he goes, yes. And so we're chatting about this, about the whole process and what he wants to do it. And I said, why does the University of Venice want to produce this play? Because I said, it's just basically a story about this big kid, knocks up women, runs away, party, dance, no responsibilities. And he says, well, I think it's something Italians can relate to. So anyways, who am I to argue or criticize? I said yes. So we spent 3 weeks translating the play into Italian, and it was such a bizarre thing to do, translation. So it gets produced in Venice, Italy, and I'm supposed to go over and see it, but for a number of reasons, I didn't end up getting over there till a couple of months later. But they sent me a videotape of the production, and it's one of the most surreal things I've ever seen, right? First of all, it's a powwow play in are there any Italians in the audience here? Let me know if I'm saying this properly. It's in a teatro, a theater. So I'm watching it, and and so it's my words in Italian. It's a set designed by an Italian set designer who'd probably never been to Canada, let alone a reserve. Costumes designed by somebody who'd never been to a reserve, let alone met a native person. And these are all Italian actors who'd never been to Canada, a powwow, or met a native person. And they're all running back and forth across the stage going, Il powwow! And so, as I said, that brings me to the crux of my story, my discussion here is about native humor and where it fits in the spectrum of overall cultural humor. Because I've been very fortunate when I was working in the world of native humor, I became more and more curious about it. And I ended up directing a documentary, as you heard, for the National Film Board, documentary on native humor called Redskins, Tricksters, and Puppy Stew. And based on the success of that, I thought, can I possibly have explored every possible aspect of native humor in a 54-minute documentary? No. So I decided to do edit and compile a book on native humor. But I didn't want it to be just a book on native humor. I wanted it to be a book of native humor. Because I've read too many, it's that dry books about humor. What is that old saying? The operation was a success, but the patient died. I've written several articles and essays on native humor, and it's really quite interesting because essentially, what makes me laugh will make you laugh, and what makes you laugh will make me laugh. At the end of the day, when I go home, I watch The Simpsons, Family Guy, The Big Bang Theory, all these things, and it makes me laugh. And 90% of the people who go see my plays or read my books or my articles are essentially non-native. And so it obviously, there is a thing back and forth. There's no particularly native way to boil an egg. The best way I know to describe something describe an exploration of any type of cultural humor is like the concept of cooking with chicken. You have chicken cacciatore, you have tandoori chicken, you have McChicken. It's all chicken, but it's the spices you use to cook that chicken that gives it its cultural uniqueness. Same with humor. Now, it's been my belief, and what do I know, that to me there are two dominant characteristics in native humor. They're not new things, they're just things that I think there's more prevalent in our humor. And our humor, much like Jewish humor, is a type of survival humor too. It can be quite barbed, but it can also be quite healing. Now, for instance, the one dominant characteristic I've come across in native humor is the concept of our humor is very self-deprecatory. We love to make fun of ourselves as a nation, or as an individual, as a nation, or all nations. If you've ever seen any of the work by Don Burnstick, a native comedian, Cree comedian, you watch his routine, 90% of everything he has to say makes fun of native people. When I was doing my book, of all the Indian jokes, I spent a year collecting Indian jokes. Most of them, 90% of those, made fun of Native people. Whereas you would think we'd make fun of white people, the dominant culture, but no, we prefer to make fun of ourselves or each other more than anything else. My favorite Don Burnstick joke, a definition of a Native family. A Native woman goes to the window, looks out, yells to her husband, "Honey, my kid and your kid are beating up on our kid." Or he does this whole thing on, he's culturally appropriated a joke line from Jeff Foxworthy. He used to do, "You might be a redneck if." Don Burnstick does, "You might be a redskin if." And my favorite Don Burnstick redskin joke is, if you know how to fillet bologna, you might be a redskin. And so some of the jokes I got for my book on Native humor, as I said, made fun of Native people. I assume most people here know what a band office or administration office is on a reserve. What do you call 50 band office employees and 50 lesbians? It's 100 people who don't do dick. What do you call 32 Métis in one room? One full-blood. And so on and so on and so on. You get the idea. So, as I've told these jokes, as I said, all over the world, and it's really quite interesting because, first of all, these jokes are, once you explain what a band office is, they get that joke. But it's really interesting because some of the jokes that are so-called Native jokes are, I don't know what the term to use, but they can be appropriated by any culture. For instance, these two Indians walk out of a bar. Hey, it could happen. Now, when I've told that joke, I have had people come up to me and say, "My grandfather tells that joke and he's Polish." Or my uncle tells that joke and he's Irish. So it's the kind of joke that can be appropriated by any culture. What do you call an Indian with a PhD? A doctor, you fucking racist. And there are variations of that joke. What do you call a black man who flies a plane? A pilot, you fucking racist. So there's all sorts of, as I said, so what actually could be an Indian joke can be almost culturally appropriated by almost any culture. And the jokes I have told and sort of explored all of this all over the world have been understood and laughed at and celebrated. All except for one joke in one country. Let me tell you the joke. These two Native women are sitting down and having tea and getting to know each other. And one woman is absolutely shocked and surprised to discover that the other woman has 10 children that she's all named Lloyd. And the other woman is puzzled and says, "Why did you name all your children Lloyd? Don't you find that confusing?" And the mother goes, "Oh, no, not at all. In fact, if anything, it's a great time saver. First thing in the morning, all you have to do is yell, 'Lloyd, time to get up. Lloyd, breakfast is ready. Lloyd, time for school.' They all hear and they all know what they have to do." But the other woman isn't convinced. She says, "But what do you do if you have to talk to just one of your kids? And like the second youngest or the oldest? What do you do then?" And the mother goes, "Oh, if I have to talk to just one of my kids specifically, I call them by their last name." Now, I got that from a Native woman on Vancouver Island, of all places. So, as I said, I've told that joke all over the world, and I've always gotten a laugh, all except for one place. So I'm up there, and I'm doing the final line. I'll call them by their last name. So again, silence, more tumbleweeds, more coyotes howling. This was in China. And I just thought, I'm just really, and I'm like, And I was doing a tour of universities there, and I just found it really odd because it didn't work anywhere, and it had nothing to do with language, because at most of the universities, they all spoke English. And I asked my interpreter, my guide, my wrangler, okay, why doesn't that work here? And she says, well, for one reason, China has a one-child policy. So the idea of having 10 children is literally and figuratively inconceivable. And secondly, their names are reversed. Their last name is their first name is their last name. So the joke makes no sense. So that's the only place I've ever been where that joke just did not connect at all. Now, so as I said, native humor, is, by any other name would smell as sweet. So all the jokes I've been telling you, almost everybody here has gotten and learned to appreciate and dealt with. Now, in terms of sort of continuing on with the new things that I've sort of discovered as a native comedian, my third native comedy was a play called The Buzzgum Blues. Now, in the dialect of the Ojibwe, Buzzgum means boyfriend or girlfriend, means sweetheart. So it was an elder's love story. And it's loosely based on an elders conference that's held at Trent University near Peterborough. So what it is it's an elders love story between between elders, between a 60-year-old or 58, the same woman from Bootlegger Blues, where she's now about 60, a 60-year-old Ojibwe woman and a 60-year-old Mohawk man. She's there to give a workshop on the Ojibwe language. He's catering it. And it's a typical story. They meet, they hate each other. Because when I was growing up, my mother, not when I was growing up, when my mother was growing up, my grandparents used to keep her and her 13 brothers and sisters in line by saying, be careful, be good, or the Nodwa would get you. And in Ojibwe, Nodwa means Mohawks. And in the Ojibwe culture, Mohawks are the boogeymen. Sorry. So my mother grew up, because I dated a Mohawk woman for about 3 years, and my mother just instinctively did not like her. So anyway, so it's a story, and I use that in the play, the fact that the Nodwa imagery in her, and she grew up with that, and they meet and they don't like each other, and at the end they fall in love. But I'm faced with a number of things. How do elders meet and fall in love? But more or less, the normal thing, there has to be a reason why these two connect and fall in love. And I was trying to find that instrument, and I was racking my brains, and my mother was telling me one day that because my grandparents had so many kids and she was the oldest, she would spend a lot of time, months living with her grandmother, my great-grandmother's house. And my great-grandmother was the only one on the reserve who actually had a basement. And the government back then, during the winter, would send in cases of canned meat, click, spam, whatever you want to call it, for the Indians to help them get through winter. And so the basement would be, they'd send it there because it was the only place with a basement. And then they distributed several times during the winter. And that's interesting. And then I think I was in Toronto or Six Nations talking with, I think it was Tom Hill, who told me the exact same story, that in Six Nations, some of them would be sent cases of canned meat by the government. And I went, ding. Because people of my generation, I don't think I've eaten spam since I was like 10 when my grandparents gave it to me. And people of my generation don't eat that, but people of the older generation do. Do you eat spam? So I thought that's what they're going to do. They're going to bond and fall in love over canned meat. And there's a beautiful scene in it where they're sharing spam, and they click it like champagne glasses. Now, following on with this funny story is, we did a public reading of it in Port Dover. I had written it there. We did a public workshop of it. Basically, actors sitting on stage reading from the script and people just coming in to hear what it sounds like. And one of the characters in it is a character named Summer, who is 1/64th Native and proud of every Aboriginal cell in her body. And so they got a lovely young actress to play her. So the actor who's playing the Mohawk guy, for a little bit of realism during the reading, goes out and buys a can of Spam. So they're all sitting up there doing their thing, and when the right time comes, he opens up the can of Spam. Now, a couple things you should know. First of all, the young girl is vegetarian, sitting right beside him. Secondly, Spam has a certain aroma, pungent aroma. I was sitting in the front row and I smelled it immediately. And the poor girl was like turning 14 different shades of green. And the actor who had bought the can of Spam had forgotten to bring a knife, a fork, or a spoon. So he takes the can and he digs his fingers into it to pull it out. And I swear the girl just about hurled. Anyways, excuse me. So that was the Buzzkin Blues. Now the fourth and final comedy. I was talking to you about sort of the universal nature of taking native humor to places like Italy and all over the place. In this particular one, I decided to bring the world to my reserve. I have done 11 lecture tours of Germany. As I'm sure many people here know, Germans love native people, even ones that look more German than native. So they keep asking me to go there and lecture and talk, and they keep throwing money at me, and who am I to argue? So I go there and I keep learning about more and more about this bizarre preoccupations that Germans have with native people. Everything from, Winnetou and Karl May and all these plays and all these different things, and all the Germans who play Indians during the summer and live in teepees. I was in Lüneburg once, just outside of Hamburg, and I swear, just driving through the city, I saw 2 teepees. So on one of my last trips to Germany, to Europe, 3 things happened that sort of stayed with me. First of all, I'm in Prague, the Czech Republic. And I'm down in the lobby waiting to leave, waiting for my ride to arrive, and I'm going through the counter. And as you know, any any hotel you're at, there are all these little cards and brochures of interesting things to do in the city. Anywhere, any hotel you're in. I pick one up, and it's for Club K5. Okay. So I'm looking through it, and in the first section, it's basically, you can go there to get a manicure, pedicure, massage, a sauna, all that sort of stuff. All right, fine. Second page was a little more eclectic. It had rates for strippers and escorts, and I didn't have any per diem. Third page was a little more weird. They had theme rooms. You could rent the Roman room where you could be an emperor with a slave. You could rent the medieval room where you could be a medieval knight with a winch. They even had a science fiction room where the bed was in a crater on the moon. It was a circular bed in a crater on the moon. And they also had an Aboriginal room where it says underneath, "Make love like a real Aboriginal." It was in a cave. The bed was on a ledge in a room designed as a cave. Now, I can't speak for other Aboriginal people in this room, but I don't ever remember having had sex in a cave. Not even on prom night. But I thought of a bunch of great lines, right? Hey, want to see my stalactite? And then I'm in Bonn, Germany. And I'm going to Theatre Bonn to lecture on native humor. On native theatre in Canada. And I'm being picked up by this young girl who's walking me to the theatre, and she looks to be about 23, 24, and she's like the assistant dramaturge at the theatre company. And we're walking, and she says, we're all really excited you're here, and we're all really anxious to hear about native theatre and all the things happening in Canada. But we've all been talking, we all have a question. I said, yes. And they said, your name, Drew Hayden Taylor, what does it mean in English? Now, when I lecture, and I often do question and answers, one of the questions I get asked wherever I am, usually outside of Canada, but in other countries, the one question I get asked that just drives me up the wall is, do you have an Indian name? And it's gotten to the point now that every time I get asked that, I always say, yes, it's Spread Eagle. So that she says this to me, what is your name, Drew Hayden Taylor, what does that mean in English? And I'm looking at her, and for about 2 seconds, I'm getting like half a dozen snarky remarks in my mind. But she has this sort of like really innocent, I really would like to know, look on her face, and I'm a guest in her country, and I just decided to shut up and just say, that is my English name. And then there was Mainz, Germany. I'm having dinner with the faculty of the local university and some of the local dignitaries, and I'm talking with this older German woman who is saying, when I was young, when almost all Germans were young, it's not so much now, but a while ago, that as kids, if we would, stub our toe, scrape our knee, or hurt our elbow, and we'd start crying, we'd go running to our parents, and our parents would pick us up, sit us down, look us directly in the eye, and say, always remember, an Indian knows no pain. And I was sitting listening to that, and I thought, I don't think we know the same Indians. So anyways, based on all these experiences with all these Germans, I decided I had to do something with it. I had to have fun with it and live with it, and make it livable. So I wrote a play called The Berlin Blues. And it's basically about a German business conglomerate that comes to a small central Ontario native community wanting to build the world's largest native theme park called Ojibwe World, because it's Ojibwe-tastic, with such things as bumper canoes, medicine Ferris wheels, and a 44-meter-high dream catcher with interlacing laser beam webbing that keeps killing all the seagulls. And the big draw is a production of Dances with Wolves, the musical. And of all places, that play premiered in Los Angeles. And it's one of these cases where, as a writer, I never know. I hate it when people say, what are you trying to say with this play? Or why did you write this play? I said, to get paid. But when it was opened in LA and it was reviewed by the LA Times, they actually told me what I meant. They said, it's obviously an Aboriginal response to globalization. And I went, oh, good. That's what I wrote. So it's talking about like native humor. It's not restricted to the reserve. It's actually become a really global thing. And based on the success of me funny. Well, actually, I should tell you an interesting story about, again, a culture class about that book, where I got into trouble with my editor. Let me tell you the joke first, and we had this big fight over it. This native guy and minister are out for a walk one day, and the minister is teaching him how to speak English. So they're walking along. I mean, this is a really old joke. I'm sure all the native people know this joke. So they're walking along, and the minister is pointing to things and saying their English name, and the native guy responds, "This is a rock. Can you say rock?" And the Indian goes, "Rock." "This is a tree. Can you say tree?" "Tree." And they spend the whole day doing this. "Those are clouds." "Clouds." And so they're doing this, and they end up down by the river. "This is a river. Can you say river?" "River." And as they're going up from the river, they go through the bulrushes, and they come upon a man and a woman in the bulrushes having sex. And the minister's all shocked and surprised and embarrassed and says, "Man riding a bicycle." And the native guy takes out his bow and arrow and puts a bullet through the man and an arrow through the man and the woman. Somebody want to get that? Right in the middle of the punchline. So the native guy puts an arrow through the man and the woman, and the minister's all shocked and surprised and says, "Why did you do that?" And the native guy goes, "Riding my bicycle."